This is chapter 6, where we're going to cover metabolism, and this is part 1. And so something that we learned way back in chapter 1 is that one of the characteristics of all living things is that they need energy, and they need to be able to transform energy. And so, again, living things require energy to live, and so energy has to constantly be brought into the organism while it is constantly being used by the organism. And so when we talk about energy, we have to talk about bioenergetics. And so bioenergetics is the study of energy flow through living systems like a cell or like an entire ecosystem. And it's important to mention here that energy flows through, but it is not cycled through. Okay, so the ultimate source of energy for our planet shown here is the sun. And so the sun's energy is released as heat and also as wave energy. And some organisms on our planet, which we call producers, like plants, they have a mechanism to actually capture that energy in the form of waves. And we'll talk about that when we go through photosynthesis. And then we have organisms that can't make their own food. We would call those consumers or decomposers. And consumers are organisms like us, animals, humans. And so we will eat organisms that either make their own food or other organisms that ate organisms that made their own food. Okay, so again, the ultimate source of energy for the planet is the sun. That energy is captured by producers, which supply energy for the rest of our planet, including organisms like us. When we die, or when producers die, there are these organisms called decomposers, which get their energy through this process of decomposition. And so fungi, bacteria, worms, which are animals, they're going to be involved in breaking down dead or decaying organic matter and pulling energy out of that. And then through these processes, heat is going to be released. But notice again that energy doesn't cycle back through it. You know, producers don't end up getting that energy back. The sun doesn't end up getting that energy back. And so in the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about thermodynamics, and some of that will come into play again. Metabolism is going to be the focus here of this first part of the chapter. And so when we talk about metabolism, that's going to be the sum of all chemical reactions that take place either inside of an organism or inside of a cell. It's going to require those processes which require energy and those that produce or release energy. Okay, and on the next slide, I have a picture here of a metabolic pathway. And so again, chapter 6 is like our chapter to get ready for the next 2 chapters, where we will talk about cellular respiration, and then we will talk about photosynthesis. Those are our 2 metabolic pathways that we're going to focus on this semester. So let me make sure you understand what a metabolic pathway is. It's a series of interconnected steps of biochemical reactions that will take whatever we start with, which is called the substrate molecule. In this figure, the substrate molecule in the beginning is molecule A. And it will convert that substrate molecule or molecules step by step. So molecule A is turned into molecule B is turned into molecule C, and molecule C is turned into our final end product, which is molecule D. Okay. Notice that each step of this metabolic pathway is going to be catalyzed by an enzyme. We will talk about enzymes throughout this chapter and then really focus on enzymes in the last part of the chapter. The arrow here means yields. So, you know, molecule A turns into molecule B. And sometimes in a metabolic pathway, you know, molecule B will build up, or molecule C will build up. And that might cause this pathway to be shut down. So we'll also talk about metabolic regulation a little bit later in the chapter. So there's, again, 2 main types of metabolic pathways that we have. There are anabolic and there are catabolic. And we'll talk about how photosynthesis and cellular respiration fit here in just a minute. So two main types of metabolic pathways, anabolic pathways and catabolic pathways. We're going to come back to that in just a second, but before we do, I want to just introduce you quickly to ATP and NADH, which are two molecules. We've already talked about ATP a little bit, but you're going to see both of these again in the next couple of chapters. So I want to make sure that we have a pretty good understanding of what they are without showing you their structure yet, just giving you an idea. And so, when we talk about anabolic and catabolic pathways, we'll talk about one releasing energy and one needing energy to be driven. And so a lot of times we have these molecules, ATP and NADH, connecting various parts of these pathways. And so when you think of both of these, you can think of them as short-term energy storage molecules. They're not long-term, right? Long-term energy storage molecules would be things like carbohydrates or fats, okay? But short-term energy storage, ATP and NADH. ATP, I want you to think of as, it is the energy currency that your cells can actually use. Your cells can't use glucose directly. Glucose has to be first broken down, the energy extracted from it and turned into ATP. And then this ATP can drive cellular reactions. Okay, so ATP again is a short-term energy storage molecule. It's the form of energy that your cells can use directly. And again, it's going to link those metabolic pathways that are energy producing with anything really in the cell that requires energy. It could be a metabolic pathway that requires energy, or it could be cellular transport, or anything that requires energy in your cell. ATP is going to be the source of that energy. We will also see NADH and its cousins, NADPH and FADH2. You're going to hear about those. So again, when we get into cellular respiration and photosynthesis, I want you just to have like a little background on what these molecules are. So NADH, again, it's a short-term energy storage molecule, but this molecule particularly, it will pick up high energy electrons, and those electrons represent energy, and it's going to bring those high energy electrons to specific places in the cell where those electrons can then actually drive the synthesis of ATP. Okay, so both of them are considered to be short-term energy storage molecules. NADH is going to carry high energy electrons, which will be used to make ATP. And ATP is the molecule that your cells can use directly for anything that requires energy. Okay, so again, keep those two molecules kind of in the back of your mind. Okay, so let's get back to anabolic versus catabolic reactions. So when you think of anabolic reactions, I oftentimes will think of like anabolic steroids, right? And so when you think of steroids, you're thinking building, right? Building muscle. And so anabolic pathways are going to be biosynthetic or build up processes where we're going to take smaller molecules, put them together to form more complex, larger molecules. So we're building larger molecules. In these particular types of processes where we're building, these are going to require energy. Okay, and so where is that energy going to come from? It depends. Again, a lot of times it's ATP, but for photosynthesis, for example, that energy is actually going to come directly from the sun. Okay, so photosynthesis is considered to be an anabolic process in which energy from the sun, which is wave energy, will be used to drive the production of glucose, which represents chemical energy. Okay, so here's the formula for photosynthesis. So we have 6 CO2. CO2 is carbon dioxide, plus 6 molecules of water, H2O, plus energy from the sun in the form of wave energy, is going to yield glucose, C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen, which is O2. And so down here in this figure, you can see there's, small molecule number 1, 2, 3, and 4. We add energy to this equation, and we end up putting those individual atoms or molecules together to form a larger molecule. So we're building up a larger molecule from smaller ones. And again, this is going to require the input of energy. Okay, it also requires enzymes, don't forget. So the second pathway is going to be the exact opposite. It's going to be a catabolic pathway, or catabolism, you might hear me say. So a catabolic pathway is one in which energy is actually released or generated. Okay, and so what happens here is we take a large complex molecule and we break it into simpler ones. And the energy stored in the bonds between those molecules, which is chemical energy, stored chemical energy, we're going to hear potential energy in a little bit too, that is going to be released. And that released energy will be used to drive the synthesis of ATP. And then ATP is then used maybe to drive anabolic pathways or to drive any other process in the cell that requires energy. This is, again, ATP is the energy currency that your cells can use directly. Okay, an example of a catabolic pathway here is cellular respiration. And so in cellular respiration, we start off with glucose, C6H12O6, in the presence of oxygen, so 6 molecules of O2, will yield or produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and then here we go, energy. And this really we could substitute in ATP. All aerobic organisms, so including us, plants, even though they do photosynthesis, they still do cellular respiration. And any other aerobic, which means uses oxygen, organisms will use that process. We'll also talk about an alternate pathway called fermentation when we get into the next chapters. So again, an anabolic pathway is a buildup, requires energy. We're building larger molecules. And a catabolic pathway, on the other hand, is a breakdown pathway in which energy is going to be released. Okay? And so again, here in our figure, we have catabolism. And so let's briefly talk about forms of energy really quick. So just a basic definition, energy is the ability to do work, and it exists in various forms. We've actually already talked about kinetic energy, thermal energy. When we talked about the osmosis lab, we actually talked about the kinetic molecular theory, which comes into play here. So kinetic energy is the energy associated with objects in motion. So it's the energy of movement. And thermal energy, again, it's pretty much the same thing. It's the energy associated with the movement of atoms or molecules. Okay? Potential energy, on the other hand, is stored energy, available energy. And that's going to be because of an object's position in space and time, where it's located. Chemical energy is energy stored in the bonds, that should be an N here, in the bonds of a molecule. And this energy can be released during a reaction. So this is one example. So chemical energy is potential energy. So when we think about glucose, for example, glucose represents chemical stored potential energy. Those bonds can be broken and energy can be pulled out, okay, and then used to drive cellular work. Another source of potential energy, again, if we go back to chapter 5, when we talked about concentration gradients, that represents stored potential energy. It's not chemical energy. It's not stored in bonds here. Instead, it's stored in a gradient. Okay, so again, another source of potential energy. Objects can transfer their energy between kinetic and potential energy. So potential energy stored in the bonds of glucose can be used to produce actually a concentration gradient, which produces ATP, which again is still stored chemical energy. And then that ATP can be used to drive other reactions that might require energy for kinetic energy, for movement. Okay, so it can be transferred back and forth. So on this slide, I just wanted to give you an example in pictures, again, of potential versus kinetic energy. So this is always in textbooks. So this is water being held behind a dam. And so this represents stored potential energy, not chemical energy, stored potential energy. Because this water is being held back, right? If this dam is opened up and the water is allowed to flow, maybe it's going to flow downhill. that's going to represent kinetic energy. So there's just been this transfer of potential to kinetic energy. This is a great example over here as well. Here we've got a race car, and here we have a hydrocarbon molecule. This is a type of fuel. Okay, and if you count up the carbons, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's octane, right? Hopefully you remember that. And so what will happen, this molecule here, every single bond here between the carbons represents stored potential chemical energy. And what will happen is these bonds will be broken, right? We say it's burnt by this car. So as those bonds are broken, energy is extracted, and that's going to be used by the car to move. And so again, we go from chemical energy stored in the bonds of this molecule to kinetic energy, the energy of motion here, that car is moving. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to mention free energy. And we have to talk about free energy to understand endergonic and exergonic reactions. I don't want to belabor this formula too much. I'm not going to ask you to use it. But I just want you to have a basic understanding of what free energy is. So free energy, which is represented by the capital letter G, which stands for Gibbs free energy. This is going to represent the amount of usable, available energy in a cell or whatever system we're looking at that's available to do work. Okay? And so every chemical reaction that takes place is going to change that amount. Okay, so this delta G, triangle G means delta G, this is change in free energy. So reactions that occur that release energy, right, are going to change the free energy of the system, increase it. And reactions that require energy are going to change the free energy of the system. Okay, so we have to have a basic understanding here. This is the formula on how to calculate the change in free energy. It's the change in H here, which represents enthalpy. That's the total energy change of the system, minus T, which is absolute temperature, which is in Celsius, and then multiplied by the change in S. And S is entropy, which entropy we'll learn a little bit more about a little bit later in the chapter. Entropy represents energy that's unusable. Okay, so again, what does this mean? Why do we care? So what I need you to know about free energy is that in exergonic reactions, energy is going to be released. And so we say that these types of reactions have a negative free energy value, a negative delta G. Okay, so what does that mean? So if we look here, this is called an energy profile. And this is on the x-axis, we have the course of the reaction, so time. And then on the y-axis, we have free energy. Okay, and so we're looking at reactants going to products. What happens over the course of this reaction? What is the change in free energy? And so in a reaction that releases energy, we would call that an exergonic reaction. That's called the downhill as well. So if you look here, we have reactants here. This is the amount of energy that the reactants have. And as the reaction proceeds, where's my pointer? You can see this line, we call it the downhill reaction. So as the reaction proceeds and products are formed, products have a lower free energy. And so if we compare reactants and products, we say that the free energy has decreased. So that's a negative, okay? The change in free energy, it's decreased. So that's a negative delta G. In reactions like this, we say that these reactions are spontaneous. So be careful with this word. Spontaneous doesn't tell us anything about rate. So it's not a reaction that's fast. It's just a reaction that can occur without the input of extra outside energy. Okay? And so again, overall, the change in free energy for this reaction is negative, and so it will run. Okay? There is still activation energy, which we'll talk about in just a minute. We do have to keep that in the back of our minds. So again, exergonic energy released, products have less free energy than reactants, and so therefore we have a negative delta G value. We would call these reactions spontaneous. We just said this. Products have less energy than the reactants. We can also call these types of reactions downhill reactions. The energy that is released can be used to drive uphill reactions. Okay. The energy, this decrease here in free energy means that energy gets released, and that is used to make ATP. An example of an exergonic reaction would be a catabolic reaction, like cellular respiration. Okay, that's a great example of an exergonic reaction. On the flip side, we have endergonic reactions. So endergonic reactions tell us energy is going to be needed to drive these processes. If we look at the change in free energy value, it's positive, which means that this is not a spontaneous reaction, and we're going to require energy to get this reaction to proceed. So ATP is needed. If we look at the reaction profile, again, reactants have less energy than products, and so there's an increase in delta G, free energy. And so again, we're going to require the input of outside energy, ATP, to get this reaction to go forward. We can also call this an uphill reaction, and anabolic reactions like photosynthesis are going to be represented here. So remember again, for photosynthesis, the energy required to drive that reaction comes from the sun directly. Okay, so endergonic is the opposite of an exergonic reaction. Okay, so I did quickly mention activation energy. So I just want you to keep this in the back of your mind, and I'll show you a couple of figures, and then we're going to come back to this when we talk about enzymes. So all reactions, both endergonic and exergonic, they require a small amount of energy, kind of this little bump, before they can proceed. And we call that the energy of activation, or the E of A. Or we also can call it the free energy of activation. All of that means the same thing. How much energy is needed determines how fast, so the rate of the reaction. So again, the term spontaneous doesn't tell us anything about rate. It's the level of activation energy that tells us how fast the reaction will be. Okay, and so you might be thinking, well, you just said exergonic reactions release energy, why would they require energy? So again, all reactions, so even the exergonic ones, they need a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a push at the beginning to reach what's called the transition state. Okay, the transition state is going to be a high energy unstable state of the reactant molecule or molecules where bonds are contorted or stressed and easily broken. So where does this energy come from? It comes from heat in the surroundings. Okay, and so let me show you an energy profile now. This looks a little bit different. This is an energy profile showing activation energy. So on the left, I have an exergonic reaction. So again, if we compare reactants and products, there's still a negative change in G value. Okay, so it's still a spontaneous exergonic reaction. However, this initial bump here, that's the activation energy. At the very top of this bump is what we call the transition state. So again, reactants need a little bit of a bump to get to here, the transition state, so that bonds are weakened and unstable to be able to proceed to products. The same thing happens here in an endergonic reaction. We've got reactants. We have to put energy in, right? There's a negative change in G that's positive. And then energy is needed here, this hump, little extra, to get to products. So activation energy is required in both cases. And so in living systems and our cells, we have a lot of reactions that are proceeding where there's not a lot of time, right, to wait for reactions to kind of get over that energy barrier, that activation energy. And quite frankly, the energy of activation might be too high for just heat in the surroundings to be able to overcome that barrier. And so that's where enzymes come into play. And so again, we're going to spend a great deal of time in the chapter talking about enzymes. I just want to introduce you to them here. You've heard about them a few times as well already. So enzymes, you know, are proteins made of amino acids. They have a very specific three-dimensional shape. They're specific to what they catalyze, right? We can call them enzymes, or we can call them biocatalysts, or just catalysts. Their job in reactions is to lower the energy of activation. And so here in this reaction profile on the right, we have in purple the reaction profile without an enzyme. So look how high the activation energy is. And then in green here, we have the reaction profile of the reaction with an enzyme added. So what happened? This hump was brought down. So we say that enzymes lower the energy of activation and help reactions to proceed at a faster rate. If we compare the free energy of reactants and products, that's still the same. So the change in free energy doesn't change. It's only the level of activation energy. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of the chapter.